My name is Dante Rivera, and I am a hotel desk clerk who survived the first 12 hours of the zombie outbreak at Westfield Valley Shopping Center on Black Friday. What started as a simple birthday shopping trip for my nephew turned into a nightmare when infected shoppers began attacking everyone around me. Trapped inside the mall with hundreds of zombies hunting survivors, I had to use every skill I learned working night shifts to stay alive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dante Rivera, and I am a hotel desk clerk who survived the first 12 hours of the zombie outbreak at Westfield Valley Shopping Center on Black Friday. What started as a simple birthday shopping trip for my nephew turned into a nightmare when infected shoppers began attacking everyone around me. Trapped inside the mall with hundreds of zombies hunting survivors, I had to use every skill I learned, working night shifts to stay alive. I need to tell you exactly what happened during those 12 hours because if this thing spreads to where you are, these details might save your life. Let me start from the beginning because understanding how this all started is crucial. I worked the night shift at the Grandview Plaza Hotel here in Phoenix. It's not glamorous work, but it taught me things that kept me alive when everything went wrong. When you work nights at a hotel, you learn to read people fast. You can spot trouble walking through your lobby from 50 feet away. Drunk guests, angry customers, people who are high or mentally unstable, they all have tells. You develop this sixth sense about human behavior because your safety depends on it. That morning of November 24th, I woke up around 10:30 like I always do after working all night. I had planned to grab lunch and then head over to Westfield Valley to get my nephew Miguel his birthday present. He had been begging his mom, my sister Carmen, for this new PlayStation game for weeks. Black Friday seemed like the perfect time to snag it on sale. But even before I left my apartment that morning, something felt off. I live in this complex in Tempe, nothing fancy, just a bunch of working people trying to get by. I know my neighbors pretty well because of my weird schedule. I see them when they're leaving for work in the morning and I'm getting home. Mrs. Chen from apartment 12B was standing in the hallway staring at her door like she had forgotten how to use her key. She kept scratching at her forearm, these long, deliberate scratches that left red marks on her skin. When I said good morning to her, she looked at me like she didn't recognize me, even though we had talked hundreds of times. Then there was Jake from the end unit. He was always this friendly guy who would wave and ask about work. That morning he was sitting in his car in the parking lot with the engine running, just staring straight ahead. I watched him for about 10 minutes while I loaded my Honda Civic. He never moved, never turned his head. Just sat there like he was waiting for something. I should have trusted my instincts right then. When you work in hospitality, you learn that when multiple people start acting strange at the same time, there is usually something bigger going on. Maybe a gas leak, maybe contaminated water, maybe some kind of chemical spill. But I was focused on getting Miguel his present, and I convinced myself I was being paranoid. The drive to Westfield Valley took about 20 minutes through normal Phoenix traffic. The mall is this huge complex on the west side of town, the kind of place that becomes absolute chaos on Black Friday. I had been there plenty of times for regular shopping, but never on a major sale day. As I pulled into the parking garage, I started noticing more of those same strange behaviors I had seen at my apartment complex. There was this family walking toward the mall entrance. The dad was carrying their toddler, but the kid was screaming and trying to get away from him. Not normal tantrum screaming, but genuine terror screaming. The mother was walking about 10 feet behind them, moving in this jerky, uncoordinated way like she was learning how to walk. A teenage couple was having this intense argument near the elevator bank. The girl kept grabbing at the boy's shirt and he kept pushing her hands away. But it wasn't playful or romantic. She was being aggressive, almost predatory. I parked on Level 3 and took the elevator down to the main entrance. The mall was packed beyond anything I had ever seen. Black Friday brings out crowds, but this was different. People were pressed together so tightly you could barely move. The noise level was incredible. This constant hum of hundreds of conversations, mixed with crying children and holiday music blasting from every store. What struck me immediately was how many people looked sick. In my hotel work, you see all kinds of travelers, jet-lagged business people, families with car-sick kids, guests who have been drinking too much. You learn to spot the signs of someone who is not feeling well. But this was different. Maybe 1 in every 20 or 30 people had this grayish-pale complexion. They were sweating even though the mall air conditioning was running full blast. Some were stumbling slightly as they walked. Others kept scratching at their skin or rubbing their necks. I made my way through the crowd toward GameStop on the upper level. The store was packed with people trying to grab deals on games and electronics. I got in line behind about 15 other customers, most of them parents like me trying to score presents for their kids. The line was moving slowly because they only had 2 registers open, and people were buying multiple items. The woman in front of me was shopping with her teenage daughter. They seemed normal enough at first, talking about which games to buy and comparing prices. But after about 10 minutes in line, the mother started acting strange. She kept looking around suspiciously like someone was following her. She would whisper something to her daughter, then look over her shoulder, then whisper again. The daughter looked embarrassed and kept telling her mom to calm down. Behind me was this older guy, probably in his 60s, wearing a veteran's cap. He seemed fine when he first got in line, but as we stood there waiting, he started getting agitated. He kept checking his watch and muttering under his breath about how long everything was taking. Then he started complaining loudly about the store management and how they should have more employees working. Normal Black Friday complaints, but his voice kept getting louder and more aggressive. The GameStop employee working the register looked exhausted. When I finally got close enough to talk to him, he mentioned that they had already dealt with 3 medical emergencies that morning. People collapsing, having seizures. One woman had some kind of violent episode and security had to escort her out. He said management was attributing it to Black Friday stress and too much caffeine. That should have been another red flag for me. In hotel work, when you start seeing multiple medical incidents in a short time period, it usually means there is an environmental cause. Bad air circulation, contaminated water, even carbon monoxide leaks can cause people to act erratically. But I was focused on getting Miguel's game and getting out of there before the crowds got worse. While I was waiting in line, I had a clear view of the mall's main corridor and the railing that overlooked the food court on the lower level. The food court was absolutely packed with families taking a break from shopping. Every table was full and there were long lines at all the restaurants. From my vantage point, I could see McDonald's, Sparrow, Orange Julius, Panda Express, and about 10 other food vendors all doing massive business. I noticed there seemed to be more commotion than usual down there. Security guards were walking around more frequently, and I could see mall employees cleaning up what looked like spilled food and drinks. There was this couple near the entrance to the food court that caught my attention. The woman kept scratching at her arm, these same deliberate scratches I had seen from Mrs. Chen that morning. Her husband or boyfriend was trying to get her to sit down at one of the tables, but she seemed agitated and kept pulling away from him. Another thing that struck me was how many people were eating. I know that sounds obvious for a food court, but this was different. People were eating with this desperate urgency, like they had not eaten in days. Families were ordering way more food than they could possibly finish. I watched one guy at the Panda Express counter order 4 full meals just for himself. The employees looked confused, but they kept serving him. The line at GameStop was taking forever to move. Each customer seemed to be taking longer and longer to complete their transactions. Some people were having trouble with their credit cards. Others could not seem to decide what they wanted to buy. The employees were getting more and more frustrated, and I could feel the tension building among the customers waiting. About 45 minutes into my wait, I finally got close enough to the register to see the game I wanted. It was right there, on the shelf behind the counter, exactly what Miguel had been asking for. I was maybe 3 customers away from being able to make my purchase and get out of there. That's when I started hearing raised voices from the food court below. At first, it just sounded like typical Black Friday chaos. Families arguing about where to eat, kids having meltdowns, the usual stuff you expect in a crowded mall. But the voices were getting louder and more frequent. I could hear people shouting, but I could not make out the words over the noise of the crowd and the holiday music. The woman in front of me with her teenage daughter was getting more paranoid by the minute. She kept looking around and whispering urgently to her daughter about needing to leave. The daughter was clearly embarrassed, and kept telling her mom that everything was fine. But the mother's behavior was making everyone around us uncomfortable. She was sweating profusely, and her hands were shaking. The veteran behind me was getting more agitated too. He started pacing, back and forth as much as the crowded line would allow. He was muttering about how the country was going to hell and how people did not know how to run businesses anymore. His complaints were getting more intense and less coherent. I was starting to feel trapped between these two increasingly unstable people when I heard the first real scream from the food court. Not shouting or arguing, but genuine terror screaming. The kind of sound that cuts through every other noise and makes everyone stop what they are doing. Everyone in the GameStop line turned toward the railing to see what was happening below. From where I was standing, I could not see the source of the screaming, but I could see people in the food court starting to move around more frantically. Some were standing up from their tables and looking around confused. Others were gathering their things like they were getting ready to leave quickly. The security guards I had seen earlier were moving more urgently now, speaking into their radios. The GameStop employee at the register was trying to maintain normal operations, but even he kept glancing toward the commotion outside. He was moving more slowly with each transaction, clearly distracted by whatever was happening. The customers were getting impatient and several people started complaining about the delays. I was 2 people away from the register when I heard the sound of breaking glass coming from the food court. Not just one piece of glass, but multiple items shattering almost simultaneously. The screaming was getting louder and more frequent now. People throughout the mall were starting to notice that something serious was happening. The woman in front of me grabbed her daughter's arm and said they needed to leave immediately. The daughter protested that they had been waiting for almost an hour and were finally close to buying their games. But the mother was insistent. She kept saying something was wrong, something was very wrong, and they needed to get out of the mall right now. They pushed past me and headed toward the exit, leaving their spot in line empty. I moved up one position closer to the register. The veteran behind me was now talking loudly to anyone who would listen about how this was probably some kind of terrorist attack, and everyone needed to stay calm. His voice was getting shakier, and his breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. Other customers were starting to look at him with concern. The next customer ahead of me was taking forever to complete his purchase. He kept changing his mind about what games he wanted and asking the employee questions about different options. The employee was clearly frustrated, but trying to maintain professional customer service. Meanwhile, the noise from the food court was getting impossible to ignore. I decided to step out of line for a moment and walk over to the railing to see what was actually happening below. What I saw down there did not make sense at first. People were running in all directions, knocking over tables and chairs as they moved. Food and drinks were scattered everywhere. But some people were not running away from something, they were chasing others. There was this woman in a red sweater who had tackled a teenage boy near the Sparrow counter. At first I thought maybe he had stolen something from her or they were having some kind of argument. But then I realized she was not just holding him down, she was biting him. Actually biting into his neck while he screamed and tried to get away. Blood was spreading across the white tile floor around them. That image is burned into my memory forever. This ordinary-looking middle-aged woman in a red sweater, probably somebody's mother or grandmother, attacking a complete stranger with her teeth like some kind of wild animal. The boy's screams were unlike anything I had ever heard. Pure terror and agony mixed together in a sound that made my stomach turn. Other people in the food court were reacting with the same confusion I was feeling. Some were running toward the attack to try to help. Others were backing away in fear. But what happened next changed everything. Within maybe 30 seconds of being bitten, the teenage boy stopped screaming. His body went limp for just a moment. Then he started convulsing violently. Then he went still again. I thought he was dead. I was already thinking about calling 911 and wondering where mall security was. But then the boy sat up. His eyes were open, but they looked different. Empty. Predatory. He looked around the food court like he was searching for something specific. Then he spotted a little girl who was hiding behind an overturned table about 10 feet away from him. The boy moved toward her with the same jerky, aggressive motion I had seen from the woman in the red sweater. Not walking or running exactly, but this determined predatory stalking. The little girl screamed and tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed her before she could get away and bit into her shoulder, just like the woman had done to him. This pattern repeated itself over and over across the food court in the span of maybe 5 minutes. People getting attacked, going still for a moment, then getting back up and immediately attacking someone else. The infection, or whatever it was, spread through the crowd like wildfire. Each person who got bitten became one of those things within seconds. Mall security tried to respond, but they were completely overwhelmed. I saw Officer Martinez, who I recognized from when he used to do security rounds at my hotel, trying to help a family escape from one of those creatures near the Orange, Julius. But 3 more of them surrounded him before he could draw his weapon. They swarmed him and brought him down in seconds. I watched them tear him apart right there in front of dozens of witnesses. The automatic security gates throughout the mall started coming down, which meant someone in the control room was aware of the situation and trying to contain it. But it was already too late. The infected were spreading beyond the food court, following the crowds of panicked shoppers who were trying to escape to the upper levels. I could hear them in the corridors now, making this awful groaning sound, mixed with the screams of people who were trying to get away. Standing there at that railing, watching ordinary people transform into mindless predators in a matter of seconds, I had to make a decision that would determine whether I lived or died. My Honda Civic was parked on level 3 of the parking garage, which meant I would have to travel through at least a quarter mile of mall corridors that were probably crawling with those things by now. The smart play was to find somewhere secure to hide and wait for help to arrive. I chose to hide. Everything I had learned working night shifts at hotels told me that when a situation is chaotic and dangerous, you find the most secure location available and you wait for professional help. You do not try to be a hero. You survive first, then you help others if you can. That decision to hide instead of run probably saved my life, but it also trapped me in 12 hours of hell that I will never forget. I backed away from that railing as fast as I could without drawing attention to myself. The GameStop line had completely dissolved as people realized something terrible was happening below. Some customers were pushing toward the store exits, others were pulling out their phones to record what they were seeing, and a few were just standing there in shock like I had been moments before. The veteran who had been behind me in line was now shouting about how this was definitely a terrorist attack, and everyone needed to follow emergency procedures. But his voice was getting higher and more frantic, and I could see that same grayish pallor on his face that I had noticed on so many other people that morning. The scratching at his neck was getting more aggressive, leaving visible red marks on his skin. I needed to get away from him and find somewhere secure immediately. Working night shifts teaches you to think fast when situations go bad. You assess your options, pick the safest one, and move quickly without panicking. Standing in that crowd of increasingly unstable people was not safe. Getting trapped in a store with limited exits was not safe. I needed to find the most defensible position in the mall and get there before things got worse. The upper level of Westfield Valley has this service corridor that runs behind most of the stores. I had noticed it during previous shopping trips because there are always maintenance workers and store employees using it to move inventory and supplies. Most customers never pay attention to these areas, but working in hotels makes you automatically notice building layouts and service access points. I remembered seeing a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" near the Spencer's store that probably connected to that service corridor. If I could get back there, I might be able to find a security office or maintenance room where I could wait safely until help arrived. The key was getting there without attracting attention from the people who were starting to show signs of whatever was spreading through the mall. The upper level was getting more chaotic by the minute as word spread about the violence in the food court. People were streaming up the escalators and stairs, some running in genuine panic, others just trying to get away from the noise and confusion below. The problem was that some of the people coming up from the food court were already infected. I could identify them by their behavior. They moved differently than the panicked shoppers. While normal people were running away from danger, these infected individuals were actively hunting through the crowd. They would stop and turn their heads like they were listening for something specific. Then they would change direction and move purposefully toward whatever had caught their attention. I watched one of them, a middle-aged man in a business suit, track a crying child who had gotten separated from her parents. The man moved through the crowd with single-minded focus, ignoring everything else around him. When he reached the little girl, he grabbed her before anyone could react. The bite happened so fast that most people nearby did not even realize what they were seeing until it was over. That little girl stopped crying almost immediately after being bitten. She stood up, looked around with those same empty, predatory eyes I had seen in the food court, then spotted an elderly woman using a walker about 20 feet away. The transformation from innocent child to hunting predator took less than 30 seconds. This was spreading faster than any disease I had ever heard of. In my hotel work, I had dealt with guests who had food poisoning, stomach viruses, even a few cases of severe allergic reactions. But those conditions took hours or days to develop and spread. This was happening in real time, transforming people into something completely different in a matter of seconds. I started moving toward Spencer's, trying to blend in with the crowd of shoppers who were heading for the exits. The key was not moving too fast or too slow, not making eye contact with anyone who looked sick, and staying aware of everything happening around me. Skills I had developed dealing with intoxicated hotel guests were keeping me alive in a zombie outbreak. The area near Spencer's was less crowded than the main corridor, which gave me a better chance to slip away unnoticed. I found the service door I remembered and tried the handle. It was locked, but it was the kind of basic commercial lock that maintenance workers need to access quickly. In hotels, these doors usually have simple key card systems or even just standard keys that multiple employees share. I looked around to make sure no one was watching, then examined the door frame more carefully. There was a small gap between the door and the frame that suggested the lock was not fully engaged. I pushed on the door while lifting up slightly, on the handle, a trick I had learned from maintenance workers at the hotel. The door opened with a soft click. The service corridor behind the stores was dimly lit and much quieter than the main mall areas. It smelled like cleaning supplies and cardboard, with that slightly stale air you get in spaces that are not designed for customer access. There were boxes of inventory stacked along the walls and cleaning equipment stored in alcoves. Most importantly, there were several doors leading to what looked like utility rooms and offices. I tried the first door I came to. It was unlocked and opened into a small storage room filled with cleaning supplies and paper products. Not ideal for a long-term hiding spot, but it had a solid door and no windows. I could lock it from the inside and wait for help to arrive. But as I was about to go in, I heard voices coming from further down the corridor. Two people were talking in urgent whispers, and one of them sounded like they might be mall security or management. I decided to investigate before committing to the storage room. Moving quietly down the service corridor, I found the source of the voices. There was a door marked Security Office that was slightly open, and I could see light coming from inside. I approached carefully and listened to the conversation happening within. A man's voice was talking rapidly into what sounded like a radio or phone. He was reporting multiple incidents of violence throughout the mall and requesting immediate assistance from police and emergency medical services. A woman's voice was responding with updates from the security camera system, describing the spread of violence from the food court to other areas of the mall. I knocked softly on the door frame and called out that I was a mall customer looking for help. The conversation inside stopped immediately. Then the door opened to reveal a mall security supervisor and a woman who appeared to be from mall management. Both looked stressed and frightened, but they were still trying to maintain professional composure. The security supervisor introduced himself as Tom and explained that they were coordinating with emergency services and mall corporate offices to manage the situation. The management woman, whose name was Linda, was monitoring the security camera feeds and tracking the spread of what she kept referring to as incidents throughout the building. I explained that I had witnessed the initial attacks in the food court and that the situation was spreading much faster than they probably realized. I described how quickly people were being infected and transformed, and how the infected individuals were actively hunting other people, rather than just acting randomly violent. Tom and Linda exchanged looks that told me they were seeing the same patterns on their security cameras. Linda turned one of the monitors toward me so I could see what they were dealing with. The camera feeds showed scenes from throughout the mall that were far worse than what I had witnessed personally. The main corridors were filled with people running in panic, while infected individuals pursued them. Store employees were trying to lock their gates and doors, but many of the security barriers were being overwhelmed by the crowds. The parking garage cameras showed abandoned vehicles and people who had collapsed or were being attacked near their cars. Most disturbing were the feeds from the food court, which now looked like a war zone. Tables and chairs were overturned, there was debris everywhere, and dozens of infected individuals were wandering around looking for new victims. But there were also people hiding under tables and behind counters, trapped survivors who were trying to avoid detection. Tom was coordinating with Phoenix Police and the National Guard to establish a perimeter around the mall and begin evacuation procedures. But the response was being complicated by reports of similar incidents at other locations throughout the city. Whatever was causing this outbreak was not limited to Westfield Valley. Linda showed me camera feeds from the mall's main entrances, where emergency vehicles were beginning to arrive. Police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks were setting up a command post in the parking lot, but they were not allowing anyone to enter or exit the building yet. The mall was being treated as a contaminated zone that needed to be contained. That was when I realized I was truly trapped. Even if I could make it to my car and drive to one of the exits, I would not be allowed to leave. The authorities were containing whatever was happening inside the mall, which meant everyone inside was considered potentially infected or dangerous. Tom explained that they were trying to establish communication with groups of survivors throughout the building and coordinate safe zones where people could gather until evacuation procedures were finalized. The security office was one of those safe zones because it had independent power systems, multiple communication methods, and reinforced doors that could be secured against intruders. I asked if I could stay with them until the situation was resolved. Both Tom and Linda agreed immediately. They said they needed all the help they could get, especially from someone who had witnessed the initial outbreak and could provide first-hand information about how the infection was spreading. The security office was larger than I had expected, with multiple workstations for monitoring camera feeds, radio equipment for communicating with emergency services, and computer terminals connected to the mall's building management systems. There were also emergency supplies including bottled water, first aid kits, and flashlights in case of power failures. Linda gave me a quick orientation on the camera system so I could help monitor different areas of the mall. The feeds were organized by level and section, with the ability to zoom in on specific locations and record footage for later analysis. What I saw on those screens was both helpful for understanding the scope of the crisis and terrifying in terms of what we were dealing with. The infection was spreading through the mall in a predictable pattern. It started in the food court and moved outward along the main corridors, following the flow of panicked shoppers who were trying to escape. But it was also spreading vertically through the escalators and stairwells as infected individuals followed, fleeing crowds to different levels. Some stores had successfully locked down and were protecting their customers and employees inside. Others had been overrun when infected individuals broke through their security barriers. The pattern seemed to depend on how quickly store managers recognized the danger and how effectively they could secure their locations. Tom was getting regular updates from the command post outside. Emergency services were treating this as a potential bioterrorism incident or chemical contamination event. Hazmat teams were being deployed and medical personnel were setting up triage areas to treat anyone who could be safely evacuated from the building. But the more I watched the camera feeds, the more I realized that traditional emergency response procedures were not going to work for this situation. The infected individuals were not acting like people who had been exposed to chemicals or biological agents. They were hunting and attacking with purpose and coordination that suggested something much more serious was happening. Linda discovered something on the cameras that changed our understanding of the outbreak completely. She had been reviewing footage from earlier in the day, trying to identify when the first incidents occurred. What she found was that people had been showing signs of infection hours before the violence started in the food court. The camera timestamps showed individuals throughout the mall displaying the same behaviors I had noticed that morning. The scratching, the aggressive interactions, the grayish skin tone, the jerky movements. These signs had been present since the mall opened, but nobody had recognized them as symptoms of an impending outbreak. More importantly, The security footage showed that many of these early infected individuals had visited the food court before displaying symptoms elsewhere, in the mall. They had eaten at various restaurants, then dispersed throughout the building where they eventually became violent and began attacking others. This suggested that the source of the infection was something in the food court itself. Contaminated ingredients, tainted water, or some kind of airborne pathogen that was concentrated in that area. The people who ate there first became infected first, then spread the infection to others through bites or direct contact. Tom immediately radioed this information to the command post outside. If the source was in the food court, then emergency. Responders could focus their investigation there and potentially identify the specific cause of the outbreak. But it also meant that hundreds or possibly thousands of people had been exposed before anyone realized there was a problem. The camera feeds showed that the situation throughout the mall was continuing to deteriorate. More stores were being overrun, more people were being infected, and the number of survivors was decreasing rapidly. The main corridors were becoming increasingly dangerous as infected individuals gathered in larger groups and began coordinating their hunting behavior. Linda pointed out something particularly disturbing on one of the upper-level cameras. A group of about 20 infected individuals had gathered near the main escalators and appeared to be waiting. They were not wandering randomly or chasing individual targets. They were positioned strategically to intercept anyone trying to move between levels. This suggested that whatever was affecting them had not completely destroyed their cognitive abilities. They retained enough intelligence to plan and coordinate, which made them far more dangerous than mindless zombies. They were predators who could think and adapt their tactics based on the behavior of their prey. Tom tried to establish radio contact with other security personnel throughout the mall, but most of the responses he received were either reports of being overrun or emergency calls for help that cut off abruptly. It was becoming clear that the security office where we were hiding was one of the few remaining safe zones in the entire building. The emergency broadcasts on the radio were reporting similar incidents at multiple locations throughout Phoenix and other cities across the country. Shopping centers, restaurants, airports, anywhere that large numbers of people gathered to eat were experiencing outbreaks of violence and infection. This was not an isolated incident at our mall, but part of a much larger crisis. I realized that my hotel experience was going to be crucial for our survival. I understood building systems, crowd management, and emergency procedures better than most people. Linda and Tom were focused on their immediate responsibilities, but someone needed to think strategically about longer-term survival if help did not arrive quickly. The security office had independent power and communication systems, but it also had vulnerabilities. The doors were reinforced but not impenetrable. The camera system showed us what was happening throughout the building, but it also made us visible to anyone who might gain access to the security network. We had supplies for a few hours, but not enough for an extended siege. I started thinking about the building's infrastructure in the same way I would analyze a hotel during an emergency. Where were the alternate exits, the service corridors, the utility areas that might provide escape routes or additional supplies? The mall's design was similar to large hotels in many ways, with public areas supported by hidden networks of maintenance and service spaces. Linda showed me the building schematics on her computer terminal. Westfield Valley had an extensive network of service tunnels, maintenance rooms, and utility corridors that connected different sections of the mall. Some of these spaces had independent ventilation and power systems that might remain functional even if the main building systems failed. More importantly, several of the service tunnels connected to loading docks and emergency exits that were not visible from the main mall areas. If we needed to evacuate the security office, these tunnels might provide a way to reach the outside without going through the infected areas of the building. Tom was getting increasingly urgent reports from the command post outside. Emergency. Responders were having difficulty establishing safe entry points into the building because infected individuals were attacking anyone who approached the main entrances. Several police officers and paramedics had already been injured trying to rescue survivors. The decision was being made to treat the mall as a containment zone until specialized units could be deployed to handle the infected individuals safely. This meant that no one would be allowed to enter or exit the building until the situation was completely under control. We were on our own for the foreseeable future. That was when the power went out for the first time. The main building systems failed, leaving us with only emergency lighting and backup power for essential security equipment. The camera feeds flickered and several monitors went dark completely. Our communication with the outside world became limited to battery-powered radios and cell phones. In the sudden quiet that followed the power failure, we could hear new sounds coming from throughout the mall. The groaning and scratching noises that infected individuals made, but also something else. Footsteps in the service corridors around us. They had found the same hidden areas I was planning to use for escape routes. The emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow that made the security office feel like we were trapped inside some kind of horror movie. Tom immediately started checking the backup power systems, while Linda tried to restore the camera feeds using the emergency generators. I focused on listening to those footsteps in the service corridors, trying to determine how many infected individuals had found their way into the hidden areas of the building. The footsteps were not random wandering like you might expect from mindless creatures. They moved with purpose, stopping occasionally as if the infected were listening or searching for something specific. Then they would continue in coordinated patterns that suggested they were systematically exploring the service areas, just like we had been planning to do. Tom got the backup cameras working again, but we had lost about half of our visual coverage of the mall. The monitors that were still functioning showed us scenes that were worse than before the power failure. The infected had used the darkness to move into areas that had previously been secure. Several stores that had successfully locked down were now overrun with infected individuals who had found alternate ways inside. Linda discovered something troubling on the building schematics. The service tunnels we had been considering as escape routes were all connected to the same ventilation and utility systems. If infected individuals had access to one section of the hidden corridors, they could potentially reach any part of the building, including the security office where we were hiding. The radio communications with the command post outside were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Tom could receive emergency broadcasts, but transmitting our status updates required more power than the backup generators could reliably provide. We were losing our connection to the outside world at exactly the time when we needed help most. I started applying the crisis management skills I had learned working night shifts at hotels. When you are dealing with multiple emergencies simultaneously, you have to prioritize immediate threats while planning for longer-term survival. The immediate threat was that infected individuals knew we were in the service areas and were actively searching for us. The longer-term threat was that our supplies and power would not last indefinitely. The hotel industry trains you to think about building systems in terms of redundancy and backup options. Every critical system should have at least 2 different ways to access or control it. Every area should have multiple exit routes. Every resource should have alternatives available if the primary source fails. I started analyzing our situation, using those same principles. Our primary location was the security office, which had good defenses and communication equipment but limited supplies and only one exit. Our backup location needed to be somewhere with independent power, multiple escape routes, and access to additional resources. Looking at the building schematics, the main utility room on the lower level appeared to meet those criteria. The utility room controlled the mall's primary electrical, water, and HVAC systems. It would have backup generators, emergency supplies for maintenance workers, and multiple access points including direct connections to the loading dock areas. Most importantly, it was located away from the main foot traffic patterns, so infected individuals would be less likely to find it. Tom was monitoring the radio frequencies used by emergency services and picking up disturbing reports from around the city. The outbreak was not limited to shopping malls. Restaurants, office buildings, schools, anywhere that people had gathered to eat were reporting similar incidents of rapid infection and violence. The common factor appeared to be contaminated food or water that had been distributed through commercial suppliers. Linda found archived security footage that showed delivery trucks making unusual nighttime deliveries to the food court vendors 2 days before the outbreak. The timestamps indicated that these deliveries happened after normal business hours and were not logged in the standard receiving records. Someone had deliberately introduced contaminated supplies into the mall's food service operations. This was not a random outbreak or natural disaster. It was a coordinated attack designed to maximize casualties by targeting locations where large numbers of people would consume contaminated food simultaneously. The fact that it was happening in multiple cities suggested a level of planning and resources that went far beyond what individual terrorists could accomplish. The footsteps in the service corridors were getting closer to our location. Tom used the remaining camera feeds to track their movement, and what he saw confirmed our worst fears. A group of about 15 infected individuals were moving systematically through the hidden areas of the building, checking every door and access point they encountered. Their behavior was becoming more organized and intelligent as time passed. They had learned to use tools, opening doors that required keys or simple mechanisms. They communicated with each other using gestures and those awful groaning sounds, coordinating their search patterns to cover more area efficiently. They were evolving into more effective predators with each passing hour. I realized that staying in the security office was no longer viable. We had perhaps 30 minutes before the infected group reached our location, and the reinforced door would not hold them indefinitely. We needed to evacuate to the utility room while we still had the opportunity to move through the service tunnels safely. Tom was reluctant to abandon the security office because it was our primary communication link with emergency services outside. But Linda supported my assessment that we needed to relocate before we were trapped. She gathered the essential equipment we would need, including portable radios, first aid supplies, and flashlights with extra batteries. I studied the building schematics to plan our route to the utility room. The most direct path would take us through 3 different service corridors and down 2 levels using maintenance stairwells. The key was avoiding the areas where we knew infected individuals were searching and moving quickly enough to stay ahead of their systematic exploration. The hotel experience that had kept me alive so far was about to face its biggest test. I had navigated plenty of hotel service areas during emergency situations, but never while being hunted by infected predators who were actively trying to kill me. The principles were the same, though. Move quietly, stay aware of your surroundings, and always have a backup plan if your primary route gets compromised. We gathered our supplies and prepared to leave the security office. Tom disabled the remaining camera monitors and communication equipment, so infected individuals could not use them to track other survivors who might still be hiding throughout the mall. Linda made sure we had copies of the building schematics and keys to access critical areas we might need to reach. Before we left, I took one final look at the camera feed showing the main mall corridors. What I saw there was a scene from the worst nightmare imaginable. Hundreds of infected individuals roaming through the building, some hunting individually and others moving in coordinated groups. The few surviving uninfected people were hiding in increasingly desperate situations with no way to escape or call for help. One camera showed a family barricaded inside a Victoria's Secret store, using clothing racks and display cases to block the entrance while infected individuals tried to break through. Another showed a group of teenagers trapped in a GameStop bathroom, the same store where I had been standing in line when this whole nightmare began just a few hours earlier. The food court camera revealed the true scope of the contamination. Dozens of infected individuals wandered among the overturned tables and debris, but they were not randomly searching for victims anymore. They appeared to be guarding the area, preventing anyone from reaching the restaurant locations where evidence of the contamination might still exist. Tom opened the security office door and checked the immediate corridor for threats. The service area was dimly lit by emergency lighting and filled with shadows that could hide infected individuals. Until it was too late to avoid them, we would have to move carefully and quietly, communicating only through hand signals to avoid drawing attention to our location. The first corridor was clear, but we could hear those coordinated footsteps echoing from parallel passages nearby. The infected search groups were close enough that we could occasionally hear their communication sounds, those awful groaning and clicking noises they used to coordinate their hunting activities. They were learning to be more efficient predators with every passing hour. We reached the maintenance stairwell that would take us down to the lower level where the utility room was located. The stairwell was completely dark except for our flashlights, and the concrete walls created echo effects that made it difficult to determine where sounds were coming from. Every footstep we took seemed amplified and potentially audible to infected individuals who might be searching nearby areas. Halfway down the stairs, Linda stopped suddenly and pointed toward the lower landing. There was something moving in the darkness below us, but we could not tell if it was an infected individual or possibly another survivor trying to hide in the same areas we were using. Tom drew his security baton and motioned for us to wait while he investigated. The shape in the darkness turned out to be a mall maintenance worker who had been hiding in the stairwell since the outbreak began. He was terrified and disoriented, but not infected. His name was Carlos, and he had been working in the utility areas when the violence started in the food court. He had intimate knowledge of the building's hidden systems that could be crucial for our survival. Carlos explained that the main utility room had independent power systems that were still functioning normally. It also had emergency supplies, communication equipment that did not depend on the mall's primary networks, and multiple exit routes including direct access to the loading dock areas. Most importantly, it had heavy security doors that could be sealed from the inside to prevent intrusion. But Carlos also warned us about something we had not considered. The building's ventilation systems were designed to circulate air throughout the entire complex, including the service areas. If the infection could be transmitted through airborne particles, then nowhere in the building was truly safe from contamination. We might be able to avoid direct contact with infected individuals, but we could still be exposed to whatever pathogen was causing the outbreak. This information changed our survival strategy completely. Instead of trying to hide in the building until help arrived, we needed to focus on getting outside as quickly as possible. The utility room would be our staging area for planning an escape route, not a long-term shelter. We had to assume that extended exposure to the building's air supply would eventually result in infection. The lower-level service corridor was darker and more maze-like than the upper areas. Carlos led us through a series of turns and doorways that I never would have found using just the building schematics. The maintenance areas down here were older and more cramped, designed for utility access rather than the broader service corridors on the upper levels. We passed several rooms filled with mall infrastructure equipment, electrical panels, water heaters, HVAC controls, the mechanical systems that kept a building this size functioning normally. In a few hours, when the backup power systems failed completely, these systems would shut down, and the mall would become an even more dangerous environment for anyone still trapped inside. The utility room was exactly what Carlos had promised. It was a large space filled with the primary building, control systems, emergency power generators, and maintenance supplies. Most importantly, it had thick steel doors that could be locked securely and independent communication systems that were still connected to emergency services outside the building. Tom immediately tried to re-establish contact with the command post while Linda and I inventoried the available supplies. We found enough food and water for several days, first aid equipment, tools that could be used as weapons, and most crucially, gas masks and protective equipment that maintenance workers used when dealing with chemical hazards. If the infection was airborne, then the protective equipment might allow us to move through contaminated areas without being exposed. But it also confirmed Carlos's warning that nowhere in the building was completely safe. We were breathing potentially contaminated air with every minute we remained inside. The radio communication with emergency services revealed how much the situation had deteriorated outside the mall. The outbreak had spread to dozens of locations throughout Phoenix and was being reported in other cities across the country. Emergency services were overwhelmed and could not provide immediate assistance to individual locations like our mall. The National Guard was being deployed to establish containment perimeters around infected areas, but their primary mission was preventing the outbreak from spreading to uncontaminated regions. Rescue operations for people trapped inside infected buildings were being delayed until specialized equipment and personnel could be brought in from other states. This meant we were truly on our own for at least the next 12 to 24 hours. We had to assume that no help was coming and plan our escape accordingly. The loading dock areas that Carlos had mentioned were our best option for reaching the outside, but they were also likely to be heavily monitored by emergency services who were maintaining the containment perimeter. Linda discovered something crucial while examining the building control systems. The mall's loading dock had independent ventilation that was isolated from the main building air circulation. If we could reach that area, we might be able to find clean air and potentially make contact with emergency responders outside the containment zone. But getting to the loading dock would require traveling through the lower-level corridors that were increasingly filled with infected individuals. The camera feeds that were still functioning showed groups of them exploring the same service areas we were using. They had become more systematic in their search patterns and were checking areas they had previously ignored. Carlos explained that there was a maintenance tunnel system that connected the utility room directly to the loading dock without going through the main service corridors. The tunnels were narrow and designed for utility access, but they would provide a hidden route that infected individuals were unlikely to discover. The only problem was that portions of the tunnel system had been flooded during a water main break several months earlier. The flooded sections were not deep enough to prevent passage, but they would slow our movement and potentially create noise that could attract attention from infected individuals in nearby areas. We would also have to crawl through some sections where the tunnels were too low for normal walking, which would make us vulnerable if we encountered threats while in confined spaces. I evaluated this option using the same risk assessment approach I used for hotel emergency situations. The tunnel route had significant challenges, but it offered our best chance of reaching the outside without direct confrontation with infected individuals. The alternative was trying to fight our way through corridors filled with predators who were becoming more organized and dangerous with each passing hour. Tom received a radio update that made our decision urgent. Emergency services had detected signs that the mall's main structural systems were beginning to fail. The power outages and damage from infected individuals breaking through security barriers were compromising the building's safety systems. There was a real possibility of partial structural collapse if the situation continued to deteriorate. We had to evacuate the utility room immediately and attempt to reach the loading dock before the building became too dangerous to navigate. The tunnel route was our only viable option, despite the challenges it presented. Carlos gathered the maintenance tools we would need to deal with obstacles we might encounter, while Linda collected the communication equipment that could help us make contact with emergency services once we reached the outside. I put on one of the gas masks and protective suits, both as protection against airborne contamination and as preparation for crawling through flooded tunnel sections. The equipment was bulky and made movement more difficult, but it might be the difference between successful escape and becoming infected during our journey to freedom. As we prepared to enter the maintenance tunnel system, I could hear new sounds coming from the utility room's sealed doors, scratching and pounding that indicated infected individuals had found our location and were trying to break through the barriers we had established. Our time for careful planning had run out, and we were about to face the most dangerous part of our escape attempt. The tunnel entrance was a narrow opening behind the main electrical panel that required us to move several pieces of heavy equipment to access. Carlos had used this route before during routine maintenance, but never under emergency conditions while being pursued by infected individuals who were actively trying to kill us. We were about to test whether my hotel emergency experience could keep us alive in conditions far worse than anything I had ever imagined. The tunnel entrance was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and we had to remove our backpacks and push them ahead of us as we crawled through the opening. Carlos went first since he knew the route, followed by Linda, then me, with Tom bringing up the rear to secure the entrance behind us. The gas mask made breathing difficult in the confined space, but I was not taking any chances with airborne contamination. The first section of tunnel was dry and relatively easy to navigate, but I could hear water dripping ahead of us and knew we were approaching the flooded areas that Carlos had warned about. The tunnel walls were lined with electrical conduits and water pipes that created obstacles we had to carefully maneuver around while staying as quiet as possible. Behind us, the pounding on the utility room doors was getting more intense. The infected individuals had definitely found our location and were working systematically to break through our barriers. I could hear multiple sets of hands clawing and scratching at the steel doors, and occasionally those awful groaning sounds they used to communicate with each other. Carlos stopped at a junction where the tunnel split into two directions. He whispered that the left passage led directly to the loading dock, but was completely flooded for about 50 feet. The right passage stayed dry but took a longer route through areas where infected individuals might have found access points. We had to choose between dealing with water hazards or potential direct confrontation. I voted for the flooded route, because water was a predictable obstacle that we could overcome with patience and careful movement. Infected individuals were unpredictable threats that could appear anywhere and attack without warning. My hotel experience had taught me that, when facing multiple risks, always choose the one you can control over the one you cannot. The flooded section was worse than Carlos had described. The water was knee-deep and ice-cold, with debris floating in it that we had to push aside as we moved forward. Worse, the tunnel ceiling was lower in this area, forcing us to duck walk through the water while trying to keep our equipment dry and maintain our balance on the slippery tunnel floor. Every step created small splashing sounds that seemed incredibly loud in the confined space. We moved as slowly as possible to minimize noise, but the water made it impossible to move completely silently. If infected individuals were in the areas above us, they might be able to hear our movement and track our progress through the tunnel system. Halfway through the flooded section, Linda's flashlight flickered and went out, leaving us with only 2 remaining light sources for the rest of our journey. We could not afford to lose another light because navigating the tunnel system in complete darkness would be impossible. I made the decision to conserve our remaining batteries by using only 1 flashlight at a time and moving more slowly to avoid accidents. The tunnel walls in the flooded area showed signs of structural damage that had probably caused the original water main break. There were cracks in the concrete and sections where the ceiling had shifted, creating potential hazards if the building's structural problems got worse. We were crawling through a space that could collapse on top of us if the mall's foundation continued to deteriorate. Carlos reached the end of the flooded section and reported that the tunnel ahead was dry but filled with debris that would slow our progress. Broken ceiling tiles, pieces of insulation, and sections of pipe that had fallen during the water damage created obstacles we would have to crawl over or around. The tunnel was becoming more like an obstacle course than a maintenance passage. Behind us, I could hear new sounds echoing through the tunnel system. The infected individuals had broken through the utility room doors and were exploring the areas we had just evacuated. They had not found the tunnel entrance yet, but their systematic search patterns meant it was only a matter of time before they discovered our escape route. The debris section of the tunnel tested every skill I had learned from navigating hotel service areas during emergencies. You have to move carefully to avoid creating noise, but quickly enough to stay ahead of threats. You have to conserve your energy for the challenges ahead while dealing with immediate obstacles that could injure you or damage your equipment. Tom reported that he could hear infected individuals in the utility room behind us, which meant they were probably only minutes away from finding the tunnel entrance. We needed to increase our pace despite the obstacles and hazards we were encountering. The choice was between moving faster and risking injury or discovery, or moving safely and being caught by the infected search parties. I made the decision to push forward as quickly as possible, while accepting the increased risks. My hotel emergency training had taught me that when you are being pursued during a crisis, speed often matters more than caution. You deal with injuries and equipment problems after you reach safety, not while you are still in immediate danger. The tunnel began to slope upward as we approached the loading dock area, which made movement easier but also created new acoustic challenges. Sound traveled differently on an incline, and we could not predict how our movement might be audible to infected individuals in the areas above us. We had to balance speed with noise control while navigating increasingly difficult terrain. Carlos stopped at another junction and reported that we were close to the loading dock access point, but he also warned us about a problem we had not anticipated. The loading dock area had motion-activated security lighting that would turn on automatically when we emerged from the tunnel. If infected individuals were in that area, the lights would immediately reveal our location and eliminate any element of surprise. Linda suggested that we observe the loading dock area before committing to exit the tunnel system. There was a maintenance grate that provided visual access to the dock area without fully exposing our position. We could assess the threats and plan our final approach based on what we actually saw rather than what we hoped to find. The view through the maintenance grate was both encouraging and terrifying. The loading dock itself appeared to be clear of infected individuals, and we could see emergency vehicles and personnel beyond the perimeter fence. But there were also clear signs that infected individuals had been in the area recently. Overturned equipment, scattered debris, and what looked like bloodstains on the concrete suggested recent violence. More concerning was the movement we could see in the shadows near the dock entrances. The infected individuals were not randomly wandering through the area. They were positioned strategically to intercept anyone trying to escape through the loading dock. They had learned to anticipate survivor behavior and set up ambush positions accordingly. Tom observed the infected positioning and identified what appeared to be a gap in their coverage near the emergency exit, closest to the perimeter fence. If we could reach that exit without being detected, we might be able to get close enough to the emergency responders to signal for help. But it would require perfect timing and coordination to avoid the infected individuals who were guarding the other routes. I studied the loading dock layout using skills I had developed analyzing hotel emergency evacuation routes. The key was identifying the path that provided the most cover, while avoiding choke points where we could be trapped if detected. The emergency exit Tom had identified was our best option, but reaching it would require crossing about 30 feet of open space where we would be completely exposed. Carlos reported hearing movement in the tunnel behind us that suggested infected individuals had found the entrance and were beginning to follow our route. We could not retreat back through the flooded sections, and staying in our current position would eventually result in being trapped between threats from both directions. We had to attempt the loading dock escape immediately. The plan was simple but dangerous. We would exit the tunnel one at a time, moving quickly but quietly toward the emergency exit while staying low to avoid detection. If anyone was spotted by the infected individuals, the rest of the group would continue toward the exit while that person created a distraction to draw attention away from the others. I volunteered to go first because my hotel emergency experience included dealing with security situations and crowd management. If I was detected, I had the best chance of creating an effective distraction while the others reached safety. Carlos would go last because he knew the tunnel system well enough to find alternate routes if our primary escape failed. The motion activated lights turned on as soon as I emerged from the tunnel, flooding the loading dock area with bright illumination that eliminated all our cover. Every infected individual in the area turned toward my location immediately, and I realized we had walked into a trap. They had been waiting for survivors to attempt escape through the loading dock, and the security lighting system was helping them identify targets. I ran toward the emergency exit as fast as possible, while Linda, Carlos, and Tom emerged from the tunnel behind me. The infected individuals moved to intercept us with coordinated precision that demonstrated how much their tactical abilities had evolved since the initial outbreak. They were no longer mindless predators but intelligent hunters who could plan and execute complex strategies. The closest infected individual reached me before I was halfway to the emergency exit. It was a mall security guard who had probably been stationed in the loading dock area when the outbreak began. His uniform was torn and bloodstained, but he moved with the same predatory intelligence I had seen in all the others. I used my flashlight as a weapon, striking him across the face hard enough to stagger him backward. That gave me enough time to reach the emergency exit, but the door was locked from the outside as part of the containment procedures. I could see emergency responders beyond the fence, but they were maintaining their distance from the building and could not hear me calling for help over the noise of their equipment and radio communications. Linda reached the exit behind me and immediately started looking for alternate ways to signal the emergency responders. She found an emergency alarm system that was connected to the perimeter monitoring equipment. When she activated it, lights began flashing on the emergency vehicles outside, indicating that someone inside the building was attempting to make contact. Carlos and Tom were fighting off multiple infected individuals who had surrounded them near the tunnel entrance. Tom was using his security baton effectively, but there were too many threats for them to handle alone. Carlos had grabbed a piece of equipment from the loading dock area and was using it to keep the infected at a distance, but they were being driven back toward the tunnel entrance. I made the decision to create the distraction I had planned, even though it meant leaving the relative safety of the emergency exit. I activated every piece of equipment in the loading dock area that could make noise or create movement. Conveyor, belts, hydraulic systems, alarm klaxons, anything that would draw attention away from Linda, who was still trying to signal the emergency responders. The noise and activity worked exactly as intended. Most of the infected individuals turned away from Carlos and Tom and moved toward the sources of the commotion I had created. This gave them the opportunity to fight their way back to the emergency. exit where Linda was now getting responses from the emergency responders outside. But my distraction also attracted infected individuals from other areas of the building. They were pouring into the loading dock through service entrances and maintenance doors, drawn by the noise and activity. Within minutes, the area that had contained only a few strategic guards became filled with dozens of infected predators who were all focused on our location. Linda managed to establish communication with the emergency command post using the loading dock's external communication system. She was explaining our situation and requesting immediate extraction when the communication equipment was damaged by infected individuals who had learned to target the technology that survivors were using to call for help. We were trapped at the emergency exit with infected individuals approaching from multiple directions and no way to communicate with the emergency responders who were only a few hundred feet away. The containment perimeter that was supposed to protect the outside world from the infection was also preventing us from reaching safety, even though we were uninfected survivors. Tom discovered that the emergency exit had a manual override system that could be activated from the inside, but it required 2 people operating controls simultaneously, while a third person provided security. The infected individuals were close, enough now that we could hear their communication sounds as they coordinated their final approach to our position. Carlos volunteered to provide security while Tom and I operated the emergency exit controls. He positioned himself between us and the approaching infected individuals with the improvised weapon he had been using effectively throughout the loading dock fight. Linda continued trying to signal the emergency responders using visual methods, since the communication equipment was no longer functional. The manual override system was more complex than Tom had initially realized. It required not just simultaneous operation of 2 controls, but also a specific sequence that had to be completed within a time limit. We had practiced emergency procedures at the hotel, but never under conditions where failure meant being killed by infected predators who were actively trying to prevent our escape. I could see emergency responders moving closer to the perimeter fence as they realized that survivors were attempting to escape through the loading dock, but they were also maintaining strict containment protocols that prevented them from approaching close enough to provide direct assistance. We were going to have to get ourselves out of the building before they could help us. The infected individuals reached Carlos's position just as Tom and I completed the first part of the emergency exit sequence. Carlos fought them with desperate efficiency, but there were too many for him to hold off indefinitely. We had perhaps 30 seconds to complete the exit procedure before his defensive position would be overrun completely. The emergency exit doors began to open as we completed the manual override sequence, but they moved slowly on hydraulic systems that were designed for normal evacuation procedures rather than emergency escapes. The infected individuals could see that we were about to reach the outside, and they increased their attacks on Carlos to prevent our escape at the last possible moment. Carlos went down under multiple attackers, just as the exit doors opened wide enough for us to escape. I grabbed Linda and Tom and pushed them through the opening, while emergency responders on the other side began shouting instructions and preparing to provide immediate medical attention. Behind us, Carlos disappeared under a swarm of infected individuals who were trying to follow us through the exit. We had made it outside, but the cost was higher than any of us had expected to pay. Carlos had sacrificed himself to ensure our escape, and there were still hundreds of infected individuals inside the mall who would continue to be threats until specialized response teams could neutralize them safely. Our 12-hour nightmare was ending, but the larger crisis was just beginning. The emergency responders immediately placed us in isolation protocols while they tested us for signs of infection and contamination. We had escaped the mall, but we were not free yet. The decontamination and medical evaluation procedures would take hours to complete, and there was no guarantee that we had avoided exposure to whatever pathogen was causing the outbreak. The decontamination process was unlike anything I had ever experienced, even in all my years of hotel emergency training. Emergency responders in full hazmat suits sprayed us with chemical solutions while we stood in a portable containment unit that had been set up in the mall parking lot. Every piece of clothing and equipment we had carried out of the building was sealed in biohazard containers for laboratory analysis. The medical evaluation that followed was equally thorough. Blood samples, throat swabs, neurological tests, psychological, assessments. Everything the CDC team could think of to determine whether we had been exposed to the pathogen that was causing the outbreak. Linda, Tom, and I were kept in separate isolation units while the tests were processed, which meant I could not get updates on their condition or share information about what we had witnessed inside the mall. During the isolation period, I had my first opportunity to see the full scope of what was happening outside Westfield Valley. The emergency responders had established a containment perimeter that extended for several city blocks in all directions. Military vehicles, hazmat teams, medical units, and media crews had transformed the area into something that looked like a war zone. The news reports I could access through the isolation unit's communication system revealed that our mall was just one of dozens of outbreak locations across the country. Shopping centers, restaurants, office buildings, anywhere that large numbers of people had consumed food from commercial suppliers were reporting similar incidents. The coordinated nature of the attacks was becoming undeniable. Federal agencies were treating this as an act of bioterrorism rather than a natural disease outbreak. The contaminated food supplies had been introduced into distribution networks with precision that required inside knowledge of commercial food service operations. Someone had planned this attack for months or possibly years, positioning themselves to maximize casualties when they activated their plan. The preliminary test results showed that Linda, Tom, and I had not been infected with whatever pathogen was causing the outbreak. But we were not cleared for release yet, because the incubation period was still unknown. We might be carrying the infection without showing symptoms, or we might develop symptoms hours or days after exposure. The medical team was not taking any chances with potential carriers. During my continued isolation, I was debriefed by federal investigators who wanted detailed information about everything we had observed inside the mall. They were particularly interested in the behavioral evolution of the infected individuals, the coordination of their hunting activities, and any evidence we had seen regarding the source of the contamination. I described the security footage Linda had found showing unusual delivery trucks at the food court vendors, the rapid spread of infection from the eating areas to other parts of the mall, and the increasing intelligence and tactical coordination displayed by the infected individuals over time. The investigators took extensive notes and asked follow-up questions that suggested they were seeing similar patterns at other outbreak locations. One investigator revealed information that put our experience into broader context. The pathogen appeared to be a modified version of a naturally occurring parasite that affected the nervous systems of infected individuals while leaving their basic motor functions intact. The modification had enhanced the parasite's transmission rate and added behavioral changes that made infected individuals aggressively seek out uninfected targets. This explained why the infected individuals had retained enough intelligence to coordinate their activities and learn from experience. They were not traditional zombies with destroyed brain function, but people whose nervous systems had been hijacked by a parasite that used them as transmission vectors. Their predatory behavior was driven by the parasite's need to spread to new hosts. The scariest part was that the investigators were not sure how long the parasite could remain dormant in infected individuals before symptoms appeared. Some people might be walking around infected for days or weeks before becoming violent and contagious. The true scope of the outbreak might be much larger than anyone realized. After 18 hours in isolation, I was finally cleared for release, with the understanding that I would need to report for daily medical monitoring for the next 2 weeks. Linda and Tom were also cleared, but we were not allowed to return to our homes until decontamination teams had verified that our apartments had not been compromised by secondary exposure. The world outside the containment zone was dramatically different from what I had left when I went shopping for Miguel's birthday present. Military checkpoints controlled access to large areas of Phoenix. Food service establishments were closed indefinitely while supply chains were investigated. Public gatherings were banned, and people were advised to avoid any location where large numbers of individuals might consume food or drinks together. My hotel had been closed as a precautionary measure because the commercial kitchen and restaurant operations were considered potential contamination risks. Most hospitality businesses throughout the city were facing the same situation. The outbreak had not just affected the people who were directly infected, it had disrupted the entire economic and social structure of normal life. I was housed temporarily in a government facility with other survivors from various outbreak locations, while permanent housing arrangements could be made. The facility was essentially a refugee camp for people whose homes and communities had been impacted by the bioterror attacks. There were hundreds of us, all trying to process experiences that defied normal understanding. Talking with other survivors revealed the true scope of the coordination behind the attacks. The pattern was consistent across multiple cities and time zones. Contaminated food supplies had been introduced into commercial distribution networks simultaneously, creating dozens of outbreak locations that overwhelmed emergency response capabilities and maximized the psychological impact on the general population. The survivors I met had experiences similar to mine but in different settings. A woman from Denver described escaping from an infected office building where contaminated catering had been served at a company meeting. A man from Seattle had survived an outbreak at a university dining hall, where hundreds of students had been infected during lunch period. The details varied, but the pattern was always the same. What struck me most about the other survivors was how many of them credited their professional skills with keeping them alive. A maintenance worker had used his knowledge of building systems to find escape routes. A nurse had recognized early symptoms and avoided infected areas. A security guard had applied crowd control techniques to manage panicked civilians during evacuation. This reinforced something I had learned during my own survival experience. Every job teaches you skills that can be valuable in crisis situations, even if those skills seem mundane or unimportant during normal times. My hotel desk clerk experience had given me the building knowledge, crowd reading abilities, and emergency procedures that kept me alive when everything went wrong. The federal investigators continued to debrief survivors for weeks after the initial outbreak, gathering information that would help them understand how the attacks had been planned and executed. They were also studying the behavior patterns of infected individuals to develop more effective containment and neutralization strategies for future incidents. One disturbing discovery was that the infected individuals were continuing to evolve their tactics, even after being contained in the outbreak locations. Security footage from sealed buildings showed them learning to use tools, setting traps for potential survivors, and coordinating activities across large areas using communication methods that researchers were still trying to understand. The psychological impact on survivors was as significant as the physical trauma we had experienced. Most of us were dealing with hypervigilance, sleep disruption, and anxiety responses that made normal social interactions difficult. The knowledge that infected individuals could look and act normal until they became violent made it hard to trust anyone or feel safe in group settings. I found myself constantly analyzing the behavior of people around me, looking for the same warning signs I had noticed in Mrs. Chen and Jake before the outbreak began. The scratching, the vacant stares, the aggressive interactions, any behavioral change that might indicate someone was carrying the parasite. It was exhausting to live with that level of constant awareness and suspicion. The facility where survivors were housed provided counseling services, but the counselors were dealing with trauma scenarios they had never encountered before. How do you help someone process the experience of watching their neighbors transform into predatory creatures that tried to kill them? Traditional therapy approaches were not adequate for the scale and nature of what we had survived. Support groups with other survivors were more helpful than individual counseling, because we could share experiences that only someone who had lived through an outbreak could truly understand. We developed informal networks for sharing practical survival, information, emotional support, and updates about the ongoing investigation into the bioterror attacks. 1 month after the outbreak, I was finally allowed to return to Phoenix to assess the damage to my apartment and personal belongings. The city was still under military control, with checkpoints and restricted access to areas that had been affected by the contamination. My apartment complex had been decontaminated, but many of my neighbors had either been infected during the outbreak or had relocated to other cities. Mrs. Chen's apartment was sealed with biohazard tape. Jake's unit was empty with signs that emergency responders had removed someone in medical distress. The normal community I had known before the outbreak no longer existed. The people who had survived were dealing with trauma, and the physical spaces carried reminders of violence and loss that would never completely fade. My Honda Civic was still parked on level 3 of the Westfield Valley parking garage, but the mall itself had been sealed indefinitely. The building was considered too contaminated and structurally compromised to allow public access. It would probably be demolished rather than decontaminated, erasing the location where my 12-hour nightmare had begun. The GameStop where I had been standing in line when the outbreak started was now part of a crime scene that federal investigators were still processing. The teenage couple I had seen arguing near the food court entrance had both been infected, and were among the casualties that emergency responders found when they finally secured the building. The veteran who had been behind me in line had also been infected, probably within the first hour of the outbreak. I returned to work at a different hotel since the Grandview Plaza remained closed, pending investigation of its food service operations. The new job was similar to my previous position, but the skills I had used to survive the outbreak made me more valuable as an employee. Management recognized that my emergency experience could be helpful for training other staff members and developing improved safety procedures. The hotel industry had changed dramatically since the bioterror attacks. New protocols required extensive background checks for food service vendors, enhanced security monitoring of public areas, and emergency response training that included scenarios involving infected individuals. The normal hospitality business model had to adapt to a world where large gatherings of people represented potential security risks. Working night shifts at the new hotel brought back memories of my experience in the mall, but it also reinforced how valuable those routine job skills had been during the crisis. Reading people, understanding building systems, managing resources, maintaining calm under pressure, all the boring aspects of hotel work had prepared me for survival in ways I could never have anticipated. 6 months after the outbreak, federal investigators announced arrests in connection with the bioterror attacks. A coordinated network of individuals with access to commercial food distribution systems had spent years positioning themselves to execute simultaneous attacks across multiple cities. The scope of the planning and the resources required suggested involvement by hostile foreign governments rather than domestic terrorist groups. The legal proceedings revealed that the attackers had specifically targeted shopping centers and other locations where families with children would be present during the contamination events. The goal was not just to maximize casualties, but to create maximum psychological trauma for the general population by forcing parents to witness their children being infected and transformed into predatory creatures. This information helped explain some of the behavioral patterns I had observed during the outbreak. The infected individuals had not been acting randomly or purely on predatory instincts. They were following behavioral modifications that had been designed to maximize terror and trauma among uninfected populations. Even their coordination and tactical evolution had been anticipated and planned by the people who created the modified parasite. Miguel's birthday came and went while I was still in the survivor facility. I never did get him that PlayStation game I had been shopping for when everything went wrong. But Carmen understood why I could not complete that simple shopping trip. She was grateful that I had survived when so many others had not. The birthday present seemed insignificant compared to the fact that her brother was still alive to celebrate future birthdays. The experience taught me that ordinary people are more resilient and capable than they realize. Every person who survived an outbreak location did so by applying skills and knowledge they had acquired through normal life experiences. Teachers used classroom management techniques to organize groups of survivors. Mechanics used their understanding of building systems to find escape routes. Parents used their protective instincts to shield children from infected individuals. But survival also required luck, timing, and circumstances that were beyond anyone's control. Thousands of people with the same skills and knowledge did not survive because they were in the wrong place when the violence started, or because they made reasonable decisions that happened to have fatal consequences. I survived not just because of my hotel experience, but because of factors I could not predict or control. The bioterror attacks changed how I think about preparedness and emergency planning. You cannot prepare for every possible crisis scenario, but you can develop skills and awareness that will help you adapt to unexpected situations. The most important preparation is mental flexibility and the ability to apply familiar skills in unfamiliar contexts. 1 year after the outbreak, I was invited to speak at emergency preparedness conferences about lessons learned from survivor experiences. The audiences were typically first responders, emergency management professionals, and business leaders who wanted to understand how to better prepare for similar attacks. I always emphasized that survival started with recognizing warning signs and trusting your instincts when something felt wrong. The story I have told you covers exactly 12 hours from the time I walked into Westfield Valley to buy Miguel's birthday present until the moment Linda, Tom, and I escaped through the loading dock emergency exit. Those 12 hours changed everything about how I understand personal safety, community resilience, and the value of ordinary job skills in extraordinary situations. If this type of outbreak ever reaches your area, remember that you are more prepared than you think. Trust your professional skills, trust your instincts about people's behavior, and never underestimate the value of knowing your way around buildings and understanding how systems work. The mundane knowledge you gain from normal work and life experiences could be exactly what keeps you alive when everything goes wrong. The most important lesson from my experience is that survival is not about being a hero or having special training. It is about staying calm, thinking clearly, and using the skills you already have to navigate through crisis situations. Every person watching this video has knowledge and abilities that could be crucial if they ever face a similar emergency. Never doubt that your normal life experiences have value in abnormal situations. What happened at Westfield Valley was 12 hours of hell that I would not wish on anyone. But it also proved that ordinary people can survive extraordinary circumstances by applying ordinary skills in extraordinary ways. If you remember nothing else from my story, remember that you are more capable of survival than you realize, and that preparation starts with recognizing the value of what you already know.